family immigrated to New York from Canada, from Montreal, Canada in 1970. And we lived in Manhattan, Chinatown for a couple of months. My father bought his house in Sunset Park on 55th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue in 1974. The realtor told him that he was in Bay Ridge. I think because to, kind of increase the desirability of that area, and that is how we arrived in Sunset Park. In terms of transportation for my mom, she worked in the Chinatown garment industry, so clearly the N line, was a convenient transportation line for her. And then my dad worked on the weekends in a restaurant, and during the week he worked in an industrial laundry in Greenpoint. But that's how we wound up in Sunset Park, at a time when it was still possible for working immigrants to buy a home. When we moved to Sunset Park, on the one side, and we purchased a typical kind of two-family limestone row house, and on one side was the DeMiglios, on the other side was the Walshes. So it was an Italian, and then it was an Irish family. On 8th Avenue, we remember that there were Norwegian little tchotchke shops. There was Otto's Bakery, and the corner of my dad's block, which is now Pacifica Restaurant, which is a very famous large dim sum restaurant, used to be a refrigeration repair shop. When my siblings and I were growing up in Sunset Park, it was, I think the Scandinavian population had already begun to decline, and it was largely Irish and Italian for the white ethnics, and then a sizable Puerto Rican and Dominican population as well. And the Chinese population, it was small, but it was largely Cantonese and Toisanese. And that clearly is a very different than what the Chinese demographic is today. I think that since the early 90s, when Sunset Park began to explode, it was really driven by the Fujianese immigration to New York City, and then settling, in Sunset Park. And of course, the Latino population has completely changed. It is no longer a native-born, Puerto Rican population. It's largely immigrants, starting with Dominicans, but now the Mexicans are the largest Latino immigrant group, followed, I think that Ecuadorians are also very large. I think those are the two largest Latino immigrant groups in Sunset Park. Parameters of the neighborhood were actually quite expansive, and I think that they were defined by the Lutheran Medical Center's application for a federal poverty designation of the community. And in fact, that's really how the neighborhood got its name. The park had always been there since the 1930s, but Sunset Park was designated a federal poverty area in the late 60s to make it eligible for various forms of federal aid. The boundaries, the southern boundary went to like 62nd Street. And then 8th Avenue was a border. And then the western border, of course, went down to the waterfront. And then the northern border, went as far north as 19th Street or 20th Street. Since then, I know that there have been different parts of the neighborhood that have been rebranded and renamed. For example, Greenwood Heights. That's a very typical kind of real estate strategy to create a separate identity for an area, to disassociate it with Sunset Park that still had a very kind of working class Latino Asian demographic. Sunset Park had a very important role in New York City's industrial economy and port economy. I mean, we're sitting here in a very extensive kind of industrial infrastructure, but and was a major employer of a lot of the kind of the white immigrant ethics in this community. Post 1960s, there was a lot of disinvestment, and it was evident in the decaying industrial infrastructure here in the city and the loss of jobs. For at that time, many Puerto Ricans were working in the industrial manufacturing businesses as well as longshoresmen in the shipping industry. Post 1965, of course, the United States eliminated eliminated the immigration policy that was based on racist quotas, and opened the doors to immigration based on family reunification skills. And so we saw the influx of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. A lot of the way that people understand gentrification is that it's about people that want to live in the city. It's about suburbanites who are returning to the city. It's kind of about people who want a particular lifestyle. The other aspect of kind of gentrification has to do with the role of the state and the role of real estate developers and the role of finance in terms of exploiting the difference between kind of existing uses, existing rents, and then what is possible to capture given changing market conditions.
Formerly known as Bush Terminal, it was a manufacturing and warehousing hub in the early 1900s. But Michael Phillips, one of the visionaries behind the project, thinks the buildings can work for today's manufacturers and even for shoppers who will want to buy their goods.
We were looking for a deal to do in the boroughs. It's more accessible, it's more open to people coming than maybe it was in the past. How do you take 6 million square feet and have it be relevant in the new economy? When you look at the jobs of the new tech economy in the latest report, some crazy number like 42% were non-degree level positions. That's huge for New Yorkers. And that's relevant, that's real.
Mr. Phillips and his partners, Belvedere Capital and Angelo Gordon, have overseen this type of dramatic transformation before. Chelsea Market, once home to Nabisco and its Oreo cookies, now has tenants like Google and Food Network. But questions remain whether companies will venture as far off the beaten path as Sunset Park. And some artists and manufacturers in the complex say they're being pushed out after years of calling Industry City home.
Anytime you improve failing infrastructure, there's a cost attached to it. So yes, I think rents have gone up. But also some of those manufacturers were in industries that weren't compatible. So yes, there's always a sense of people having their cheese moved, if you will.
I mean, there were very, very deliberate, explicit kind of New York City EDC efforts to kind of rebrand the industrial waterfront as first as kind of a center for arts and artists, and then as now part of this kind of innovation economy. What is kind of the future of manufacturing is no longer going to be labor intensive manufacturing, but high value added, high knowledge content. And that is part of kind of the rationale for what's happening here along the industrial waterfront. But in fact, it really is not about job creation, and it's not about kind of providing opportunities to the surrounding neighborhood residents. So increasingly we have a very bifurcated Chinese immigrant population. And for those that have money and resources, they're going to want to invest in real estate, because real estate in New York City is a very stable, it's a very valuable, high status type of asset to own, and not just for the Chinese, but for many different groups and investors. So yes, we do see in Sunset Park the growing presence of property owners who are not owner occupants. They're not buying their property to live there, they're buying them as investment properties. And when you're an investor, you have a very different motive than if you're a homeowner. And of course, there's also just transnational real estate developers, that are doing business both in the United States as well as in China, with the financialization coming either from China or from U.S. banks, but they are the developers.